that sounds very interesting. Yeah, do let me know more about it.
Sure, definitely.
When do you plan to run it?
So in a month's time, because we already had 4 treatment arms, and yeah.
Okay, great.
One more minute, and I think people will join.
Yes, all the best, everyone.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is my privilege to welcome you all today to the webinar on understanding the causal effects of social norms on behavior and the role of social norm strength. Through this series of webinars, we aim to demystify social norms and create a deeper understanding on their nature. I am glad that Dr. Aaron and Dr. Nergis have graciously agreed to share their knowledge and expertise around social norms with us today. This event is being hosted by the South Asia Social Norms Learning Collaborative. SASNLC is jointly hosted by PCI India and CSPC Ashoka University. We are happy to share that we have now evolved into a vibrant community comprising 42 organizations, over 87 subject matter experts, and more than 350 individual enthusiasts. SASNLC is a platform that encourages meaningful discourses around social norms. The vision of the collaborative is to advance normative change by encouraging our members to strengthen conversations and build capacities on what social norms really are. We have planned a very engaging event for you all today, and we look forward to your active participation. I now like to invite my colleague Cheryl from CSPC to share the housekeeping rules and introduce our moderator. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Right. So a few housekeeping rules is, one is that please keep yourselves on mute and keep your videos off unless requested to do otherwise. And post the session, we will have a question and answer round. So we'll request you to post your questions in the chat box, but otherwise also during the sessions, if you want to ask anything, please feel free to put your question on the chat box. Great. So today's session will be moderated by Nargis. Nargis Darvish is a senior research fellow at the Center for Social and Behavior Change, serves as the lead behavioral scientist of the Pop-Up Lab. With a background in economics and a keen interest in behavioral and experimental economics, Nargis conducts experiments to delve into decision-making processes under conditions of risk and uncertainty. Her expertise lies in eliciting individual risk and time preferences, shedding light on the complexities of human behavior in economic context. Nargis holds a PhD in economics from the University of Leicester, where she also completed her master's degree. Her academic journey spans over 13 years, during which she excelled in teaching a diverse range of courses at both the University of Leicester and Al-Zahra University. Prior to joining the Center for Social and Behavior Change, Nargis served as an assistant professor at Al-Zahra University, where she authored an introductory book on behavioral economics in Farsi, making this insightful field accessible to a broader audience. This book was well received and had a second edition within 3 years of publishing. So over to you, Nargis.
Thanks, Cheryl. So I'm now going to introduce Dr. Aaron C.K., who is an assistant professor in sociology at the Collegio Carlo Alberto and an affiliated researcher at the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technologies. His research studies interpersonal cooperation and conflict and mechanisms, particularly social norms, reputation, signaling, and dominance hierarchies that reduce or increase them. He uses empirically tractable theories and employs multiple methods to explore micro-level individual decision-making and the resulting emergent macro-level social phenomena. His work has been published in Nature Communications, Social Science Research, Social Psychology Quarterly, and the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organizations, among others. Today, Aaron will briefly introduce the concept of social norms and take us through various approaches to test the causality between social norms and behavior, and if at all such causality exists. He will talk about social norms' strength, for example, what makes some social norms to be weak and others to be strong. And lastly, Aaron will talk about experiments that explore all of these things. For example, the causal effect of social norms on cooperative behavior, the role of risk in strengthening social norms of cooperation, and if comparatively stronger social norms have consequences on behavior. Welcome, Aaron. We are all ears and the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, and hi everyone. Just give me one moment to share my screen. Good. Do you see my screen okay? Okay, fantastic. Right, so hi everyone again, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So as now gets mentioned, I'm talking about two topics. This is about understanding the causal effects of social norms and behavior, and the role of social norm strength. And so, first of all, these are huge topics. So I will only really touch the very surface of them and speak only about particular aspects of them, partly because there's a broad range of findings, results, some which are very directly relevant, some which are less directly relevant. And also because we don't know a lot still. There is really a lot left to do. So I would also encourage you to work on these topics, as there's really a lot left to do. So these two topics also seem a little bit disconnected, but they do strongly interrelate. So let me get into it. What I'll do today is I'll give you a very brief introduction about social norms so that we're all on the same page. I'll tell you about some theory and existing works about the causal effects of social norms and behavior. I will do the same for social norm strength. And then I'll tell you about some of my ongoing research, which draws on two empirical papers, one which came out in 2021, and one which is unpublished, but it should be ready for a submission very shortly. So let's jump straight into it. I think as we all sort of appreciate and understand or feel on some intuitive level, our social lives are often governed by pressures that compel us to behave in certain ways. They tell us, for instance, to queue at the bus stop. People in England, this is where the photo is from, take this extremely seriously and will be outraged if others try to cut in the line at the bus queue. Also tipping. This is another sort of social practice, which practice can compel us to follow. Tipping is followed and heavily normative in certain countries, like the US and Canada, and much less so in others. In Italy, for instance, tipping is not expected. And in other cases, paying your taxes, that's another sort of normatively governed behavior in many cases. So important are social norms, as social scientists have called them the cement of society, like John Elster. That is, it binds society together and it prevents them from disintegrating. Or as Christina Bicchieri calls them, the grammar of society. Like a set of linguistic rules that structures our language, social norms structure our social behavior. That makes it regular and predictable and gives us guidance. We can start with a very basic and broad definition that many scholars agree on. There are disagreements about specifics, but this is a general definition that is broadly agreed upon. So we can think about social norms as shared behavioral rules. So that is, they speak to a behavior, paying taxes, queuing, or tipping, that proscribe or prescribe actions. So proscribe, forbidding, or prescribe, saying you should do this, and that are followed because of reciprocal expectations amongst individuals, and in some cases, social punishment. That is, people follow them because they have expectations, shared expectations, and they can be worried about social punishment. So now that we have this very basic intuition of what a social norm is, a key question we want to understand is, how do they affect behavior, or do they affect behavior at all? I want to start here by sort of going back more than 15 years to sort of give you the situation like it was in 2006. And you'll see why I talk about 2006. Here is a quote from Cristina Bicchieri, which I think sums up very well what was going on in terms of research on social norms. She writes, despite the ubiquitous reference to the concept of social norms in the social sciences, there is no consensus about the power of social norms to direct human action. For some, norms have a central and regular influence on human behavior, while for others, the concept is too vague and the evidence we have about norm compliance is too contradictory to support the claim that they have appreciably affect behavior. So essentially, she's saying that while some social scientists talk about social norms ubiquitously and frequently, there was still debate and discussion about whether they're a useful concept in the first place, perhaps they're too vague, and whether the evidence that we have actually supports the fact that they shape our behavior. And this was partly because of, so these two things are interconnected. Because of the concept was a little vague at the time, it was very easy to interpret the same evidence from different perspectives. That is, the same evidence, like a behavioral pattern, some people may look at, and some researchers looked at, as supporting the presence of a social norm and behavioral effects of social norms, while other researchers would look at the same fact and disagree. So to try and move beyond this and to understand whether social norms truly drive behavior, we needed a more precise theory of what they are and how we can separate them from related constructs that they're often mistaken for. And this is exactly what Cristina Bicchieri did in her, really foundational book, The Grammar of Society. What Cristina did in this book is to, among other things, present a conception of social norms that allowed us to move beyond this much more vaguer state of affairs, whereby we could use the definition and conception she provides to differentiate social norms from related ideas, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and really to pinpoint whether social norms are causing a behavior or not. So, Bicchieri defines a social norm in the following way. And notice that this is consistent with the broad definition I gave you at the start. It just specifies it further. She proposes that a social norm is a behavioral rule specific to a context, that a rule and a context go together, and that is followed because of two kinds of expectations, empirical expectations and normative expectations. These behavioral rules can also be followed sometimes because of punishment. Okay? So this definition that she proposes has a number of important ideas. But one of these is that the social norm is conditionally followed. There's this followed based on specific conditions, based on, or at least partly, empirical expectations and normative expectations. So she says this is conditional, and two, the key part of that conditionality is social expectations. She also has other conditions. I won't go into those now, but I do recommend looking at page 11 of her book for further details. It's a fantastically clear account. So what are these two social expectations? One are empirical expectations, which are just what you believe others do. And the other is normative expectations, what you believe others think that one should do. So one is your belief about an action and the prevalence of an action. The other is your belief about, it's a second order belief. It's a belief about what you think others think should happen, or what ought to happen. When these two social expectations change behavior, and there is this behavioral rule, we can say that a social norm exists. By adding these conditions and defining the idea of empirical expectations, normative expectations, Bicchieri was able to separate social norms from these related ideas or concepts like habits, which you can think of much more as simply actions that we take because we've taken them in the past, sort of an ingrained regularity that we have at the individual level, and which are not conditioned on empirical and normative expectations. We can also distinguish social norms from descriptive norms or conventions, which are not only based on empirical expectations. A classic example of a descriptive norm is something like driving on the left or the right-hand side. It doesn't really matter which side we drive on, but the key thing is we should drive on the same side that we expect others to. So if everyone drives on the left, we should do the same, and that is a behavior. Also helps us to separate social norms from moral norms, which are more individually held, normative attitudes or values, or even preferences. And these are a bit like habits, are primarily unconditionally followed. That is, instead of thinking about what others do and what others think one should do, if something is a moral norm, we follow it because we believe that's the right thing to do on an individual basis. And finally, legal norms. Legal norms are not based upon social expectations. They are not based upon what we think others do and others think we should do. Rather, they're based on following a behavioral rule that is enshrined into law. And it's coupled with the fact that legal norms have a specific enforcer, the police, the judiciary, and so on. One point to mention is that Bicchieri's account is what she calls a rational reconstruction of a social norm. She does not aim to give a precise descriptive account of the proximate cognitive and emotional mechanisms. Rather, she's thinking here about what are the ways in which we can conceptually distinguish a social norm from these related factors, and what should be the predictable association between changing empirical expectations and normative expectations and a behavior. That is, if those are changed, the behavior should change, and that would be consistent with her rational reconstruction. Now, there's lots of work that has existing literature and existing work that to some extent identifies a causal role of social norms on behavior. But a large set of these existing research and studies can be thought of as classic behavioral approaches. One of the earliest, which does not claim to study norms, but rather social pressure, and some people interpret that as norms, is Solomon Asch's famous experiments. Probably many of you already know this, but it's a foundational work in social psychology, where Asch essentially brought subjects or students into a room and gave them a very simple task to do. He asked the subjects to look at one line, which is the reference line, and he gave them 3 other lines to compare this to. The task was simply compare the reference line and identify which of the 3 other lines it is most similar to in terms of length, because the other 3 lines all varied in terms of being shorter, longer. And there was a match between the reference line and one of the 3 lines. And this was a very easy task, because if you ask people, which is what he did, to do this alone and to identify the link between the reference line and the 3 lines, people will do it the vast majority of the time correct. I think more than 95% of the answers were correct. So it's not a visual problem. Simply you can see what's going on, and it's fairly easy to do. But what he did in the other treatment, instead of having people create this task alone, is that he brought them into the laboratory in groups of 8. 7 of these people, unbeknownst to the final 8th person, were Asch's helpers, whom he paid. And what happened is, one by one, he would go around the room and ask the 7 people what they thought the reference line corresponded to. And the trick was that they gave the wrong answer. Then, once the final 8th person, who was real experimental subject, saw that the other 7 gave the wrong answer, the question is, what would they do? Would this subject, decide to go along with the majority, or would they break the majority and go with what they know is true? He showed that actually a large percentage of the people, but not all of them, would go along with this majority, and to some extent. So yeah, I showed that there is this social pressure effect. That other classic studies by Cialdini who leave visual cues of norm breaking. What I mean here is leave, for instance, rubbish on the ground and see whether leaving rubbish on the ground means that other people will also throw trash on the ground. The idea being that seeing that some people break a norm means that you're freer to break the norm too. It gives them this sense that the norm is weak. Or more recently, work by Arthur Schramm and Gary Charnes, putting people into an experimental laboratory and looking at their generosity, the dictator game, that is allocation decisions, how much does one person give to another, but doing this in public or in private. The idea being that in public, when people's decisions are made public to everyone in the experimental room, there should be more social pressure or normative effect, thereby increasing generosity, is what they find. And there's many others. You'll see some of these are very influential works in different theories, different fields, excuse me, like Ferengacher's work on the public goods game with punishment. But if we're being very precise, these are really interesting works that look at how behavior affects other behavior or visual cues of behavior, but it doesn't exactly identify the causal effect of social. For instance, think about the Solomon Asch studies that I just told you about. It's possible that the social pressure is not changing normative expectations or actually imposing a sense of normativity on the 8th subject. Rather, it's possible that it just makes them question their own judgment, in the sense that perhaps they misheard the experimental instructions. They think that the other 7 people actually know something they don't. So this is not normativity, it's simply inferring that maybe they got instructions wrong. More an instrumental concern. Likewise, for Cialdini's studies on leaving visual cues of norm breaking, you may infer that the probability of being punished, leaving trash around, is much lower. So then you can throw trash, you are freer to do that. Not because there is a reduction in normative expectations or a reduction in normative pressures, rather that you make this cost benefit an intuitive level calculation and think that it's unlikely that you're caught, and hence you do it. And the same can be said for many existing studies. Indeed, there's very few causal tests that actually directly manipulate empirical and normative expectations and see how that leads to changes in behavior. There is this one early exception by Cristina Becchieri and Alex Jiao in 2009, which has now become a key reference point for norm manipulation. And there are, of course, now in the past year or two, other works that try and more precisely change social norms and look at the causal effects of testing expectations. Indeed, in this review paper by Cristina Becchieri and some of her co-authors in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, they go over some of these in more detail. Okay, so that's one side that I've told you about so far, the causal effects of social norms on behavior, some theory and some existing work. Let me now tell you about the other side that I'm addressing today, social norm strength. So this idea of social norm strength primarily comes from a theory that was made established by Michel Gelfand in a 2011 science paper known as tightness-looseness theory. In this paper, they propose and also find extensive empirical evidence for the idea that we can categorize cultures and societies on a dimension known as tightness-looseness, whereby cultures that are loose have few norms, social norms, and that these social norms are also weak, have small normative pressure attached to them. And this is coupled with a high tolerance of deviant behavior. What this means is that breaking a social norm induces little or no punishment. On the other side, you have tight societies which have many strong norms and a low tolerance of deviant behavior, such that breaking a norm leads to large punishment. So then, just to give you an idea, an example of tight that's often used, a society that's tight, also in Gelfand's book, is Japan. There, for instance, that's a nice example of this tightness. In 2018, after a World Cup loss in which the Japanese football team lost, the Japanese fans stayed after the match to help clean up the stadium. In contrast, Canada is often considered a loose society. And here, after the Vancouver Canucks lost in a Stanley Cup final, important ice hockey game, there were days of riots. The fans responded here extremely differently. There were days of riots leading to millions worth of dollars in damage. So why is this idea of tightness looseness relevant? Well, because tightness has been found to co-vary with a range of socio-political and economic factors. Across multiple papers, it's been found to positively predict religious participation, negatively predict prejudice, happiness, participation, collective action, and alcohol and drug use. That is, tighter cultures are associated with lower prejudice, lower happiness, lower participation in collective action. But increased government authoritarianism, media restrictions, education, criminal justice legislation, as well as police officers on the street, and indeed even with innovation and economic growth. I should say these exact associations are not settled, but there is some evidence of these across multiple papers. You'll see some indication that this is not entirely settled in the innovation component. That is, tightness seems to be associated with incremental innovation, but lower substantial. So perhaps these subtleties also matter for the other variables. But I think the main point here is that tightness co-varies with a range of important socio-political and institutional factors. The other main point here is that the theory argues, and there is some evidence for this, that differences in norm strength evolve as a function of social and ecological threat. Specifically, tighter societies are those that have experienced more natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and so on. Also higher disease prevalence, fewer natural resources, and indeed a greater threat from territorial invasion. The idea being that these frequent or repeated threats force societies to develop stronger norms and punishments for violators in order to help them to coordinate in the face of these threats, to organize and to work collectively. And that leads to the tight norms that we see. So, where is this evidence coming from? Well, the vast majority of this evidence comes from cross-sectional observation studies. What this means is that researchers go out, run a survey experiment, or a survey, excuse me, measuring tightness looseness using a set of 6 items that are established. And then they correlate this tightness looseness with various outcomes, like I told you about government authoritarianism, economic growth, prejudice, and so on. And this has been done in multiple papers. Pertti Pelto did this with small-scale historical societies, and he was the first one to propose this tightness looseness theory. Then Gelfand really put it on the map in her science paper of 2011, and others have followed this up with more recent work. But a main problem with using this cross-sectional observation approach is confounding. Also reverse causality, but confounding is another point. That is, it's possible that it's not tightness looseness causing these economic or social or political factors. Rather, it's the reverse, or indeed even a third factor that has not been observed or accounted for. So causality is unclear. There is also a more recent paper that uses longitudinal data from the US, but here too it's difficult to pin down causality. And Jackson and his co-authors use indirect linguistic measure of tightness, not the established index. There's also some theoretical work supporting the idea of tighter societies developing under conditions of risk. But in simple terms, perhaps overly broad, but I think just to get an idea, direct causal evidence that supports tightness looseness's consequences on behavior and the role that risk plays in shaping tightness looseness is essentially missing. And so here's where my ongoing research comes in. I'll tell you about 2 experiments. Let me focus on the first one. The first one is a 30-day online experiment that looks at cooperative social norms. We conducted this in June and September of 2018 in Spain with almost 300 people. And the idea here was to use a precise and incentivize measures of social norms, and also capture behavior. Unusually, we did this longitudinally over the 30 days, measuring how social norms or social expectations change over time in response to risk, and also manipulating them to see the causal effects. So through this approach, we get causal evidence, the role of risk on social norms and social norms and behavior, and indeed, the reverse. We actually capture social norm strength using a measure that we propose, and I'll tell you about. And the second paper, which I'll only mention at the very end, is a direct replication of this first study. So the design is exactly the same, everything is exactly the same. Rather, what we wanted to do is to see whether the results that we found in this first study hold up to scrutiny. If we rerun exactly the same study, do we find the same things? Hopefully, we should. This was a direct replication on the same population in Spain with, again, around 300 people. And it was conducted a few years later in 2020. So what do we actually ask in these papers? We have three relevant research questions. One, do social norms causally affect cooperative behavior in our studies? And the prediction directly flowing from Bicchieri is simply that social expectations should causally affect cooperation if a social norm governs cooperation. Our second question is, does risk strengthen social norms of cooperation? Indeed, directly flowing from tightness-looseness theory, we expect that risk should strengthen social norms of cooperation, since exposure to risk should make norms tighter and stronger. And our third research question is, do stronger social norms have consequences on behavior? The idea here is that if you have a strong social norm in place, it's difficult to change a behavior. Once there is a set of strong expectations about what one ought to do, and there is strong punishment on its deviation, that behavior that is being regulated strongly should be sticky, difficult to change. And so what we expected in our experiment is that stronger norms make cooperative behavior sticky, and they also increase punishment for non-compliance. There's people who break the norm should be punished more harshly. We pre-registered these on the Open Science Framework, the analysis plan. And this is the paper that came out of it. So let me tell you about the interaction setting. This is actually the setting in which our subjects made their decision. What we used is a collective risk social dilemma, which was proposed by Manfred Milinski and his co-authors to model natural disaster prevention, particularly climate disasters. And we used sort of a simplified version of this. What we did is we put people into groups of 6, gave each person an endowment of 100, which are tokens which would then be converted into money at the end of the experiment, so that they were incentivized to behave, so they reveal their true decisions. And each person was asked to contribute from between 0 to 100, so nothing of their endowment. And there was a threshold to this public goods game. Well, what does this threshold mean? Well, it's set at 300. And its relevance is that if the sum of the contributions that everyone from the group of 6 puts into the pot is reached, so you reach the threshold, at least equal to the threshold or it exceeds the threshold in terms of the sum of these contributions, then what happens is that each participant keeps the amount that they did not contribute. You keep the amount that you didn't spend on the pot. If instead the sum of these contributions are lower than the threshold, you don't manage to reach the threshold as a group, your entire group loses everything with a certain probability, or keeps everything, or sorry, keeps what you did not contribute with 1 minus that probability. So this is like the idea of a natural disaster. If you don't prevent a natural disaster, then with some probability, you lose your money, your endowment, it's P, or you get lucky, there's always stochasticity, and you keep your money even if you didn't avert the natural disaster. Briefly, in terms of game theoretic solutions to this setup, the outcome depends on P with these parameters. Specifically, if P is less than 0.5, then the only Nash equilibrium is 0, whereas if P is greater than or equal to 5, then there is 0.5, excuse me, then you also have cooperative Nash equilibria. There are 2 symmetric ones. One symmetric one is basically everybody contributes half of their endowment, so that 6 times 50 is 300, so you reach the threshold. And the other, which is risk dominant, everybody contributes nothing, in which case you lose everything with 0.5 and keep 100 with 0.5. So that's the basic setup. And here's the overview of the experiment in a more general way. What we did is we had people in the first day of the experiment. They made their decisions to a number of surveys, which tried to measure their psychological characteristics through the Big Five, their risk preferences, demographic characteristics, or their other regarding preferences. I didn't mention, but this was an online experiment. So that's why we could do it over 30 days. In day one, people joined the platform. They made these decisions in the questionnaires. Then they made one decision in the collective risk social dilemma to contribute or not. They made one decision every day for 28 days. The idea of, actually, let me describe more specifically the situation. If you look to the left here, you see the groups, people are already in groups of 6. And we did that at the start of every round. Then we would either ask them to make a decision to contribute, or we would ask them to tell us about their social expectations, so empirical and normative expectations. The reason we did this probabilistically was simply to balance out whether, so one may be concerned that people first contribute and then based on their contributions tell us about their expectations, or that they give us their expectations and then behave consistently with that, so that the ordering may matter. So by randomizing the order of these two, we avoid any issues. That's why there is a split here. But essentially the point is we first ask about behavior and then expectations. Then on a certain subset of the days, in day 1, 5, 10, 14, 15, 19, 24, and 28, we ask them about their conditional contributions. This gives us causal evidence about the role of social norms, and I'll tell you in a moment exactly how we did this. Then at the end of each round, essentially, we calculate the threshold. If they reach this, the points are saved. If they don't, there is a probability of losing all their points and some probability of keeping the points they saved. At the end of the experiment, we also asked about their punishment preferences. That is, imagine you are matched with someone else in this experiment who contributed less than 50 in their final decision. How much do you want to reduce their points? Imagine you're matched with someone who contributed 50. How much would you reduce their points? And imagine if you're matched with someone who contributes more than 50. How much do you reduce their points? And they were given extra tokens to make this decision, and their decisions were actually implemented. That is, each point that they reduce, so they could spend a number of tokens, and each point that they spent, their token reduced 3 tokens of the other person. So it's a costly punishment here. And finally, we asked them about their expectations about other people in the session. That is, who would other people punish? And we incentivize this by matching behavior to beliefs. The closer people got, the more they were paid. Okay, a quick word just to say why we chose this unusual setup over running it for 30 days, actually. The idea was simply that we thought that letting people decide in their own time without having to rush would allow them to internalize more clearly the consequences of their decisions and to decide very freely, thoughtfully about what they would do. And perhaps this would allow social norms to develop and change and even crystallize over time. We thought that this would be much harder to see and to identify in a short 60-minute lab session. But this is open. Actually, it's an open question. It was very much an intuition. Right, let me tell you about the measurement and what we did in terms of measuring cooperation and the social expectations around it. To get the behavior, we asked simply, how much do you contribute? Well, to get social norms, we asked empirical expectations. How much will the other people in your group contribute? And for normative, how much do the other people in your group think that we should each contribute? We also elicited personal normative beliefs, which are much more like these moral norms or moral values about individual people's beliefs about what's right. as an important factor to separate, and it's also useful for incentivization. In the conditional contribution stage, this is where we manipulate social expectations. What we did is we gave people something known as a partial strategy method. That is, we asked people to make 4 decisions in 4 different states of the world. We said, how much do you contribute if others in your group contribute a lot and think that you should contribute a lot as well? This is high empirical and high normative expectations. What would you do if others contribute a lot but think you should contribute a little? The high empirical and low normative expectations. We also asked them about the reverse. What would you do if others contribute little but think you should contribute a lot? And finally, we asked them when both expectations are low. What would you contribute if others contribute little and think you should contribute little? Now, this was not hypothetical. This was incentivized because we asked people this before they knew whether others had contributed a lot or little, and what they thought about, and whether, and before the people making the decision knew about the personal normative beliefs of others. So once people had made their 4 decisions here, what we could do is we could look at the group's actual decision of that round, their actual personal normative beliefs, calculate whether there are high or low empirical and normative expectations, and then implement and actually pay the people in the study based on one of the 4 quadrants that actually happened. So this way, it's a real decision that's implemented and has consequences of them, but we see the choices that people make in all 4 states of the world. Finally, we measured social norm strength. We thought there are 3 components to this. One is consistency. We thought how consistent, the idea is here to measure how consistent the group members' beliefs in terms of their empirical normative expectations, and as to what extent do they overlap. For another component is social norm strength, accuracy. The idea here being that stronger social norms are more accurate in terms of what the underlying factors that they should represent. That is, empirical expectations should be closely linked to behavior, and normative expectations should closely be linked to personal normative beliefs. And finally, we thought the social norms are also stronger when there is a very narrow distribution of group members' beliefs. So if empirical and normative expectations say that you should contribute 50, that's probably a stronger norm. If they say instead that you can contribute anywhere between 20 to 70, that's likely to be a much weaker norm. So you have a larger range of possible actions. We can combine these into this social norm strength index that we created by multiplying consistency, accuracy, and specificity. And finally, the final component of the design is that we use 2 treatments. In treatment 1, in which about half of the subjects participated, there were 14 rounds with a high probability of disaster, and the second 14 rounds had a low probability of disaster. While in treatment 2, it was exactly the reverse. Right, let me move to results. So the first question is, do social norms causally affect cooperation? What do we find? Looking across time and people's decisions in the game, we can see, and this is across multiple models here, we can see that empirical and normative expectations always significantly and positively predict cooperation. So people who have higher empirical and higher normative expectations contribute more to the pot. This is the case when there are no controls, some controls, or even really extensive controls, such as personal beliefs or the psychological measures, as well as lag variables. But the question really is this only an association or it's also causal? What we can do here is look at their conditional contributions, plot them in this violin plot. So on the x-axis, you have the 4 different settings: low empirical, low normative, high empirical, low normative, low empirical, high normative, and finally, both expectations high. On the y-axis, you have contribution, and you see that the distribution moving from left to right, this bottom part is lost and it squeezes together. The dashed lines show the mean, and it very clearly shows that the mean contribution increases 33.9 all the way up to 52 almost, when people's empirical and normative expectations are changed from high to low. What about social norm strength? Does risk strengthen social norms of cooperation? Well, using this operationalization that we came up with, because in this study, we couldn't use the standard tightness looseness index. Instead, we preferred to use this coupling of behavior with social expectations, we find the following. On the x-axis here, you have a round number moving from 1 to 28. And on the y-axis, you have social norm strength. It's something that varies from around 0.5 if people are making their decision by random, all the way up to 1. Look at these blue shaded area and the red shaded areas. The blue shaded area corresponds to the treatment in which people first face a high risk and then a low risk, while the red corresponds to that in which people first face the low risk and then the high risk. And what you can clearly see is that social norm strength is higher when there is high risk than when there is low risk. In one treatment, it goes up and then decreases. In the other, it's exactly the reverse. So here we have causal evidence for this tightness-looseness idea. The next thing we want to check is, do stronger social norms have consequences on behavior? And to see this, you can look at the blue line, which is average contribution, and the red line, which is average contribution, but in the other treatment. So the blue line corresponds to the high-low treatment, so high risk first and low risk second, while the red line corresponds to the low-high treatment. Look specifically at this disjuncture where we change the risk. And what we find is at this disjuncture point, when the change occurs, the change happens much quicker for the low to high treatment because social norms are weaker than it does for the high to low, in which social norms are stronger. But as it takes longer to decay for the contributions in the high to low than in the low to high to increase. Moreover, we find evidence in terms of punishing. There is marginal evidence that punishing is more targeted in the treatment in which the risk is high, so low to high at the very end, than it is in the treatment in which the risk is low, so social norms are low. But this p is 0.07, so it's significant only at the 10% level. And finally, we find the expectations of punishing are more targeted, is what people expected others to do in the low to high than in the high to low. Exactly the same reason. So these two correspond. So let me summarize briefly. Research question 1, what do we find? Do social norms causally affect cognitive behavior? The answer is yes, we find that. We show this correlationally, we find this causally. Research question 2, does risk strengthen social norms of cooperation? Answer is yes, we show that too. Do stronger social norms have consequences on behavior? Yes, it looks at it makes its behavior stickier and also increases targeting. Okay, so we rerun this study, this unpublished replication in 2020. Let me briefly tell you what we find. Exactly the same setup, the same population. So the first research question, do social norms causally affect cognitive behavior? Yes, we think this is a very solid and replicable finding. Does risk strengthen social norms of cooperation? Here too, yes, we again think this is a very solid finding. Unexpectedly, when we looked at do stronger social norms have consequences on behavior, we found no. Unlike in our original study, we did not find that the decay of contributions was slower when it came from the high risk treatment, and we did not find the differences that we expected in terms of punishment either. So let me conclude briefly. We find that social expectations do cause early cooperation, and this supports decades of behavioral work, from the work by Ernst Baer, Gachter, to others, these classic behavioral approaches, Joe Hendrick's work. So what we've done is we add this extra causal brick into the wall of social norms and our understanding of how social norms shape cooperation. And now it's clear through Buchieri's work and also through these empirical evidences that social expectations can cause cooperation. We also find that high risk increases social norm strength, providing causal evidence for tightness theory. Although here is a caveat too, which is that this was done with monetary risk, not physical risk, as the theory technically predicts, earthquakes, disasters, and war. What about social norm strength and behavior? Well, here we find mixed evidence. This is an interesting and I think an important future avenue to work on. Let me just conclude on the 2 points of future work. And while I said that social norms are extremely important in cooperation, I think an important future avenue for research is to understand under what conditions and when social expectations are relevant behavior. It seems like for cooperation in the lab, this is clear. But what about for other behaviors? A key part here is measurement, using measurements of social expectations to try and identify. Second avenue is really this link between social norm strength and behavior. We find mixed evidence, so it's unclear whether social norm strength does matter for behavior, despite the fact that intuitively it seems that this idea of stronger social norms really should shape behavior. And why is this relevant? Well, because it has potentially important implications for interventions. If you know that social norm strength matters for changing norms, that it's harder to change, you should either spend a lot of resources in changing those norms or target high-profile influential figures in the community. Whereas if you think that a social norm is weaker, you may be able to take a distributed approach, targeting many people who are not necessarily influential in the community, and social norm change could happen easily. That's it for my slides, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a fascinating talk, and we have received many questions. So I'll start with this one. Is it possible for the same social norms to be loose in certain contexts and tight in some other contexts? And additionally, social norm strength is a function of time.
Okay, that's a great question. So the first thing I do about it is, one thing to think about that is that social norm strength, you can think about it as a micro level factor or a macro level. What do I mean? Tightness, looseness, as Gelfand thinks about it and she measures it, is macro level. It's at a country level. So you measure the sample people from a country and say, in general, are the norms in your country strong? Are there lots of punishments? So that's a macro view. What we did in the study I just showed you was more the micro view of social strength. We looked at a specific norm of cooperation or contribution, and we said, how strong are expectations about this? To what extent they correspond to behavior? So in terms of whether the same social norm can be loose in certain contexts and tight in others, from the macro level perspective, this would not be the case, as it's a general cross-behavioral perspective. While for the micro level view, yes, absolutely. Social norms of cooperation can be very tight. Social norms regarding dress codes can be loose. So it can very much depend. And in terms of time, so the work on this is sort of, I think the principle is yes, in principle it can be, but there's not much empirical evidence on this. There's one place in which there is empirical evidence, coupled also with the papers I told you about. In 2020, I ran a large-scale study with 81 other co-authors. So we collected data from 44 countries across the world directly after COVID, and by chance we had exactly the same data on social norms before COVID. So what we could see is we had 43 countries. So we ended up with 30,000 responses from people across 43 countries across the globe about their social norms before and after COVID. And what we see is that these macro level tightness, looseness essentially doesn't change. It's extremely stable in response to such a strong and global threat. On the other hand, micro norms that are specifically targeted behavior like hand hygiene or norms of spitting changed and increased substantially. So what this seems to suggest is that specific norms can change quickly, while more broader norms that matter across multiple behaviors take a long time to change.
Interesting. Thank you very much. So a related question that I have is like, during the COVID era, in some societies, we noticed that there was a change in social norms regarding social distancing. So I'm wondering like how tightness, looseness theory can explain this and whether it's the threat or the fear of the threat that governs the behavior.
Okay, that's an excellent question as well. There is a paper by Michel Gelfand in Lancet Global Health looking at the relationship between tightness, looseness, and COVID cases and death. And there does seem to be an association. So tighter countries had lower cases of COVID and deaths. But keep in mind this is observation. They're just doing cross-country correlational work. So at the end of the day, there could be confounding. Still, it is interesting evidence. Could you remind me the second part of the question?
So I was just thinking about like this tightness looseness theory, and I was wondering whether it's the threat or the fear of the threat, because my understanding is like if the fear of threat changes, people change behavior.
Okay, so actually it's not specified in the theory. So this component is unclear in terms of theory. In this 43-country study that I told you about, what we did is, in addition to getting data about norms, we tried to get at exactly these mechanisms. So what we did, we asked people about their fear of COVID through 3 questions that we then aggregated into one index. We asked them about the perceived prevalence. We gathered data actually through the Oxford Stringency Index, which is the Oxford government tracker, so it's an open, publicly available data. We merged that. And we also combined sort of COVID cases and deaths. And so what you would expect if any of these changes are driven by the actual threat is that COVID cases and deaths should predict any changes that we see. Yeah, what happens is that the fear of COVID is what seems to predict. It's not the government stringency, it's not the perceived prevalence, it's not the cases and death. It seems to be fair. So any changes that we do see seem to be primarily working through fear. Yeah, but I should highlight this is one study. So
yeah. Patricia from CSPC has asked about attrition rate and how you have incentivized participation along the 30 days.
Okay, so attrition rate was extremely low. We started out with 300 and we ended up with 287 in one and 293 in the other, if I remember. We sent reminders on emails. The average payment was fairly high. So I think the average payment was around 18 or 90 euros for the totality. We were fairly strict. So if people missed 3 days of decisions, we excluded them. And then we did one final thing, which I suspect may have helped. It's not entirely clear. What we said is that one person's outcomes are multiplied by 10 in terms of the payoff. So there was a lottery at the very end in which people could earn up to, I think, a maximum of 300 euros for their participation. And this combination seemed to work.
Yeah, and did subject had the whole day to respond?
Exactly. Yes, they could respond at any time during the day.
Okay, perfect. So another question is, can you provide an example of an instance where social norms have been intentionally strengthened or modified to achieve change?
Yes, so I think the COVID-19 gives a good example of this and the government's response to this, although it's not entirely clear, as I was saying, whether this is, well, it's not entirely clear the links, whether this is due to government strategy or more direct in people's fear of COVID. But it does seem to be the case that based on this study that I told you about, hand washing norms and hygiene norms across multiple areas were changed substantially. At least near the start, there was this sudden increase. But I mean, there's also others. So Leonardo Burstein, for instance, has a nice paper in American Economic Review and his co-authors, which use sort of an information revelation approach to try and change norms of supporting women working outside the home in Saudi Arabia. So they asked Saudi Arabian men to complete a questionnaire about how much they support women working outside the home. And they found that there was a big misperception. By and large, men wanted or were happy if their wives worked outside the home, but they thought that other men in the community would be unhappy. And so what they did is they revealed this information, trying to correct beliefs. And they saw that men after the fact were more supportive of their wives going out to work. And indeed, with some behavioral measures such as, I think, sorry, not behavioral, but survey measures of intention to find work, they did find that also wives of men who've had this information treatment were likelier to be looking for work. And I think even they had behavioral evidence that women whose partners had this treatment ended up looking for work more frequently. So I think that's a really interesting and nice case as well. But there's others. There's neat work on sort of quasi-experimental work looking at the introduction of different soap operas with the aim of changing attitudes about domestic violence and so on.
Yeah, we have so many more questions, so I'll ask as much as I can. So the other one is, like, you mentioned that social norms are not always relevant for behavior, and to uncover the same measurement is the key. The problem is, like, program designers and implementers do not always have access to run these experiments. So what is your advice for that?
Yeah, okay. I would, my suggestion would just be to run a pared down version of a questionnaire. Well, actually, my suggestion would be twofold. Qualitative interviews, just pre-testing, those can already reveal whether there seems to be a normative component going on just through the use of language. If we use ought, should, these can be revealing. And this can be coupled with a more systematic survey-based approach where you don't need to manipulate them necessarily, but just measure it. How many, through the approach I used in this paper, which is more directly relevant to Bicchieri, through measuring empirical expectations, normative expectations, personal normative beliefs, and a few other components. You would want to measure possible confounds as well. For this, I would suggest looking at Christina Bicchieri's paper of 2014 in Frontiers of Psychology. And that's a very nice guide of how to do this with her approach. But you could also use another approach that is now established in economics based on Krupke and Weber. And that uses a coordination mechanism approach. But it's not particularly long. So I would suggest using qualitative work coupled with one of these two methods. One thing I should say on this, though, is that I think these measures are now well established in laboratory and in lab in the field settings, but I think it's really still unclear exactly whether these measures are great in the field. That's something that a lot of people are working on. Do these measures actually predict outside of the lab behavior? And that's sort of on the frontiers of where we are. So it's no magic bullet, but maybe one of these two approaches.
Yeah, I think Shaker has a related question, and he's asking, should we target economic, law, institutional policy changes to change cultural tightness and looseness rather than directly changing strong social norms?
I don't know is the answer. I think that would be one intuition, yes. So certainly one intuition would be to use this top-down approach, but another intuition could also be to target influential people. They're trying to change strong social norms not through institutional approaches, but by highly influential people in the community. That may also make a lot of sense in case of tight social norms. And intuitively too, if there are tight or strong social norms in a community, you would probably want to spend a substantive amount of resources. That is, put it another way, either you should spend very little and not try to change those social norms, or you should really commit to trying to change them. Because again, we don't have good evidence for this at all, but intuitively, if the norm is very strong, then it would be a waste to sort of go an intermediate approach.
Yeah, we have many more questions, but I think time does not allow us to ask them. Thank you very much for this session. Over to you, Cheryl.
Yes, I'm sorry some of your questions were left unanswered, but we're really short on time. Anyway, so thank you so much, Dr. Aaron, for the session and for answering our questions. I personally learned a lot, and I hope others did too. And thank you so much, Nargis, for being a part of this and moderating this. I would also like to thank all the participants for being a part of this. Your participation is what makes these webinars so valuable and important. We will also be sharing the webinar recording with all of you soon. Also, if you're not already a part of our collaborative, please do register. You can register as a part of your organization or even individually. The registration link can be found in the chat box, and you can also register through our website. Lastly, please do follow us on our social media handles to stay updated on the latest developments in the social norms field, as well as any other events that we may be hosting. And thank you so much, and we wish you have a great weekend ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for showing up, everybody. Bye-bye.